So we are on chapter 25, the last section, and we're going to be talking about the United Nations. We went over World War II onto the after effects of the war, into the Potsdam Declaration and the dividing up, and how communist Russia now, communist Soviet Union, I should say. I don't like to say Russian because it was the Soviet government coming in and controlling the nations of Eastern Europe, especially with dealing first off with Poland. But then again, another of the Potsdam and that Roosevelt had established before was that they wanted a peacekeeping power in the midst of Europe there by a United Nations to get together and be peacekeepers. They wanted to form this organization, which they did. So the United Nations formation on January 1st, 1942. So this is before the war ended. They gathered with 26 allied powers, and they agreed on putting forth, when the war ended, when they could, bring together the United Nations. So the declaration by the United Nations, which endorsed the Atlantic Charter to defeat the Axis powers. So they said, these peacekeeping countries, we need to get together and we need to enforce this nations uniting together in this league. You remember, it used to be the League of Nations, but now it would turn to a new chartered group that would get together as for peacekeepers, called the United Nations. Went from the League of Nations now to the United Nations. So they were then joined by 21 additional nations by March 1945. So we had 26 and now we had 21 more. They first got together in Quebec, Canada at a conference in August of 1943. And then later a Moscow conference. Of course, Russia was in the midst. He was one of the, basically Stalin was involved in all this, and Russia was one of the so-called peacekeeping nations at that time, at least proclaimed peacekeeping nation. So, and Moscow conference in October 1943. So first they met in Quebec. First they met, as looking for the Atlantic Charter in the midst of the Allied powers. First they met in 1942. Then in 1943 they met in Quebec. Then they met in Moscow in October. October of 1943, a few months later, and made plans for an international organization that was agreed upon as a peacekeeping organization. At the Tehran conference in Iran, where FDR, President Roosevelt, suggested to Stalin and the Organization of Assembly of all member states a committee to discuss social and economic issues, to bring in the peace between nations. So they got together first, that first conference in Tehran. Roosevelt's still alive, right? This is only like in 1943, when the Tehran conference met. So the big four, who would be the big four in the United Nations? It would be the United States, Great Britain, Soviet Union, and China would be the big four. He set forth this. So here's a picture. Here's a picture of meeting here. In Tehran. Here we go. Here's a picture here, and we have Churchill and Stalin's not in that picture. But anyway, meeting together for a peacekeeping United Nations meeting. The United Nations set up at Dunbarton Oaks. So more concrete plans for the United Nations were drawn up at Dunbarton Oaks. And this is a estate, kind of a resort estate near Washington, D.C. So from August to October in 1944, American, British, Soviet, and Chinese delegates made a rough draft for this new international organization called the United Nations at Dunbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C. They recommended a General Assembly of all members and a Security Council that included the Big Four and an additional 6 members. So the big four would be the Security Council, then on to this General Assembly of all these nations. And so here's a picture of meeting at Dunbar. Here you have in the back of Dunbar Oaks is a resort. So they all went like swimming. It's kind of weird, but here's a picture. Here's a picture of Dunbar Oaks in Washington, D.C. And here's some of the delegates from all different countries. The drafting of the UN was done later on in San Francisco, California. So 13 days after President Roosevelt's death, now President Roosevelt dies, 13 days later, President Roosevelt was probably getting prepared. He had to take a vacation to prepare for the UN, especially, at that time, they were very behind the League of Nations even. When you think of Roosevelt and his wife, thinking of, okay, this is it. We need to get together and draft this United Nations. And so thousands of delegates and assistants from 50 different nations gathered on April 25th, 1945 in San Francisco to draft a charter for the UN. The delegates adopted the UN Charter then on June 26, 1945, after 2 months of meetings. Remember, September is when Japan surrendered. So this is still before the end of the war. And they're getting together. So, and like I say, when Eleanor Roosevelt, she was there, and pictures of her. She was really into the UN very much for her husband after he died, but of course we have the UN getting together. Okay, this is how it was created. I'm going to go through this really quickly, but they'd have how they put this charter together, how they created it, and the way it works. They have a general assembly. All the member nations receive one vote. All the different nations in their general assembly. These are all the nations that are involved. It doesn't matter how big or little your country is. It can be a tiny, tiny country, or it can be a huge country. They got one vote. And then they had the Security Council. And there was 5 permanent members and 10 non-permanent members that were elected for 2-year terms to enforce proposals. If the 9 members are in favor, the veto power was only given to the permanent member. Basically saying the Security Council would keep things in order, 5 permanent members, and then they would elect the non-permanent members, 9 of them, so you have 5 and 9, to control the security of the United Nations. And then they'd have 18-member Economic and Social Council to study economic and social problems and make recommendations to the General Assembly. So these would be individual nations, and the UN would specialize. The different agencies are going to come and say, okay, what do we need to do? What do we need to study? Do we need to study economically, social problems? What do we need to do? And so they'd be 18-member Economic and Social Council would get together. Number 4, they'd also have an International Court of Justice. And this is where they would determine international disputes based on international laws. So they'd have a court of justice. Number 5, that was 4. But number 5, a trusteeship council of members administering trust territories. So they'd have a trustee council. Number 6, they'd have a secretary. The secretariat, run by the Secretary General, and his staff would handle the administrative work, and elected by a simple majority vote. So we'd have the secretariat. So basically we have here, these are the different, we'd have this, the general, what do we have for General Assembly, security members, onto the Economic and Social Council, onto the International Court of Justice, Trustee Council, and onto the Secretary. This is just the way the United Nations is formed. So here's some pictures of a meeting in San Francisco with the United Nations to put all this together, to say, how are we going to be run with all these countries? So the first meetings of the UN. So after the charter was signed, it was sent to each of these signing governments to be officially ratified by that country. And then the United Nations Charter went into effect on October of 1945. This is right after Japan surrendered in September. September 2nd, Japan surrendered. This is right at the end of the war. The United Nations went into effect. So they were getting everything way prior to this time ready. And now they have it all going on October 1945. So the first official meeting was in London on January 10th, 1946. The General Assembly decided to establish a permanent headquarters in the United States. So they thought, where is there going to be our headquarters? Well, let's have our headquarters be in the United States. They picked it. Well, there's some big billionaires that decided to give money for the United Nations. I have a feeling they're kind of like the idea of being able to control nations. I don't know. But John D. Rockefeller Jr. gave the United Nations $8.5 million for a permanent home in New York City. And then New York City added a gift of land to it, said, okay, we'll give you the land. And then $65 million was added by the United States government to have the UN meeting, the UN United Nations building in New York City. Here it is, United Nations building in New York City. The new building, paid for by, Rockefeller and the United States government. And then we have the United Nations there. The first meeting on January 10th, 1946 was in London, and then on to building this. It was occupied the United Nations occupied its new building in New York, and not until 1952. So we're talking from 1945 to 1952 was a few years before they could build that big building, but they did. And now it's in New York City. Well, World War II was the most devastating war in history. Nations basically sought once again to unite in the pursuit of peace. Was the United Nations working? Well, today we know not too well, that's for sure. However, with the United States and the Soviet Union wanting control, now we're going to have this Cold War going on between the free nations and communism, and new nations springing up. And the pursuit of peace would prove to be very unattainable in time. So will the United Nations be able to complete their objective of peace? No. Especially we see how they've treated Israel now, but we're not going to get into that. Well, here we have some pictures, the devastations of the war. As we see the atomic bomb, we have in the midst of this, the cities being devastated. As you can see, here was what went on in Germany, the devastations of war. Well, I am going to go on here to the next video here, so you can see how kind of more on some more to the positive, well, I shouldn't say totally positive, a little bit more on the war here, and then we'll be done with this chapter. More about World War II. We're going to talk about in this video, and this part is the Neser, Japanese American soldiers, the Navajo code talkers, and was the bomb justifiable? So these are all in your book, little articles, but I wanted to add these here because I thought it was very important. So here we have this picture. Here's Iwo Jima, our memorial. Here's the end of the war picture. This is a classic picture of this young soldier, kissing the nurse, a beautiful nurse here. And then we have these pictures of the tanks in the air. And this picture known as, this is in Okinawa, this young soldier. And of course I put this one here of this young soldier feeding some kids in, I think it was in New Guinea, Papua New Guinea. So let's begin. Before we begin, let me put it into beginning. Go ahead here. Okay, here we go, those pictures again. The Nisei Japanese soldiers, many Americans feared that the Japanese Americans might join Japan in fighting against the United States. As a result, all Japanese Americans were relocated in detention camps in America. We already went over that. Their businesses were sold. They were left to ruin. Their normal daily lives were ceased to exist. It was pretty awful. But a few Japanese went into the military and proved their value, and more Japanese young men in the camps were given opportunity to serve in the United States Armed Forces, and many of them did. So the Nisei were the Japanese soldiers coming in to fight for America. So the Purple Heart Battalion, they called them. The 442nd Regiment combat team. The combat team was known as the Nisei, second generation, means second generation, Nisei the word, and the men were all sons of Japanese immigrants. During the war, they displayed unflinching devotion and courage. By the end of the war, the 442nd RCT had earned the distinction of being the most decorated infantry unit in all of the United States Army. So they were the most decorated with medals. 18,000 rewards together, including 7 presidential citations and a Medal of Honor, were given to these Japanese soldiers Japanese American soldiers in battles in the battalions of the Allied forces in America. So the 100th Battalion of the 442nd was called the Purple Heart Battalion because almost every member had earned one or more Purple Hearts. They all had been wounded in battle at some time in some way. They fought in many battles and with unquestionable loyalty to their country, the United States of America. They fought for the United States of America. Most were they were American citizens, and the 442nd were the most decorated infantry in all of the United States Army. Yeah. How amazing. Then there were the Navajo code talkers. So radio communication between battalions needed to use secret messages, and these were utmost importance. The Japanese, of course, were experts in breaking codes. So any new code was considered obsolete within 24 hours the Japanese had broken it. Then Philip Johnston, the son of a missionary to the Navajo Nation, suggested to the U.S. Marines in 1942 that they use the Navajo native language to transmit secret messages. Johnston heard of earlier successful attempts to use Navajo as code because the language was so complex, there's no way the Japanese would be able to decipher it. Indeed. Here you have some pictures of look how young they are, young Navajo code talkers. The Navajo language. The Navajo language was unwritten at this time, and only another Navajo or someone who had lived with them could really understand it. So it was estimated that only 28 people in the world, other than a Navajo, had a fluent understanding of the language at all. So the Marines began recruiting the Navajo for their Code Talker program. So 4 months after Pearl Harbor, 29 Navajo Indians were being trained in basic communications. The differences, they had to find out the differences in their tribal dialect, their voice inflections, their lack of words to describe military terms sometimes, and all these were obstacles to overcome, but they got them all together to overcome these obstacles. Here's some picture of the Navajo Code Talkers. Look how young they look. And then they have Navajo soldiers in the iconic raising of the flag. Actually, at Iwo Jima, one of the soldiers there was a Navajo Indian. And here's a Navajo Code Talker sending a hidden message. Navajo code talkers worked together. The code talkers worked together to devise and memorize over 400 common phrases and words before actually going into battle. The program was a complete success. The Navajo code was never broken by the Japanese or by anyone. By the end of the war, there were approximately 400 code talkers. They played important roles in all of the South Sea Islands during the marine maneuvers on Guam, Palaleo, and Iwo Jima. Here's a picture. Look how young they look. They look like little kids, but here they are. Here's like 400, the platoon. Here's the code talkers. The last we're going to go over here is, was the atomic bomb justifiable? We let an atomic bomb down on Japan. Did we have to do this? So many today argue that the United States was wrong to have dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The alternative, though, could have been much worse. After the battle for Okinawa, which was the bloodiest battle, the United States military officials began planning for the invasion of Japan, and they codenamed it Downfall. And this plan had two phases. Number one, the Operation Olympic was to begin on November 1st, 1945, and it would target southern Kyushu, that's part of Japan. And then there was the Operation Coronet that would target Honshu, the second invasion. So we already had all these invasions planned, if the bomb wasn't dropped. Here's Truman, actually. You see, was the bomb justifiable? Here's a picture, isn't that a picture of the bomb? They called this Downfall, the name of it. The entire operation would have required several million American soldiers would have to go into the operation. It estimates that at least 250,000 American casualties were anticipated on the island of Kyushu alone. So we basically would have probably lost 250,000 American, or they'd be killed or wounded. And then experts predicted over 1 million casualties would occur on both sides. 1 million people. Japan had already begun stocking up for resources by the end of July in 1945. It was not surrendering at that point. Japan didn't surrender until after the bomb was dropped. And so they were going to use this defense, and millions of Japanese were prepared to defend their homeland. Remember, a lot of them were kamikazes. They would die, basically commit suicide. There was a lot of suicide bombers. They believed in reincarnation and Buddhism, and they worshipped their emperor, But anyway, Japan was prepared, and an assault would have been a total catastrophe, so catastrophic for both sides. So here's a picture, the end of Operation Downfall. So this was we're looking into, more people dying, devastation, since Japan did not surrender. President Truman made the fateful decision now to drop the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the downfall plan was not necessary now. Although the bombs killed 200,000 people overall, many more people would have perished, in the Allied invasion. If this happened, many more, at least 1 million people would have perished. The decision to drop the atomic bomb and to hasten their surrender, and that so many more people would not have died on both sides. So here's a picture of the bomb. Here's a picture of what the bomb looked like before they dropped it. Here's a picture of the bomb dropping. So let's go ahead. We're going to end there. You can kind of see my shadow here, but anyway, it was quite a deal going through World War II. Now we're going to go on. We're going to go on into the Cold War of America as we go on into American history. I hope you enjoyed listening. I was like, going through this has really, really brought, what that time, the devastations that this war brought, World War II, and knowing that even my father-in-law, he fought in World War II. So this is near to our time, exactly, so we are living in the post of that. And now what?